down visiting my sister in Douglas, Arizona, and we went out one night, and it was the night of Piercy's meteor shower, and it was just an awesome display. And ever since, I've wanted to see it again in Arizona. We've been here now 4 summers where we could have seen it, and the last 3 have been horrible nights to watch meteor showers. So, 2 weeks ago, we went up to Sedona to watch meteor showers, and of course, you know what it did that afternoon? It rained. Around 11 o'clock at night, the clouds broke. Ben and I went up to the airport of Butte, and we were up there for about an hour and a half, and we saw 45, 60 meteors that night. We went back the next night. We didn't see as many, but boy, they were bigger. They had long tails, and they shot across the sky. That's an awesome thing. I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to do that, and I finally got to see some meteors again in Arizona. But you know, to get to Sedona, how do you get there? You know, we took the 303 from our house. We'd come up to 17. You take 17 north up to 269, pick up 89, and head up into Sedona. At least that's the way we go. And maybe you go a different way. I don't know. But as you're heading up 17, you come to this town. It's called Rock Springs. And some of you familiar with Rock Springs? Well, as we're headed there, there's this place they're known for their pies. And the person who made me aware of those pies was a gentleman by the name of Ed O'Connor. And some of you may remember Ed. Some of you may not have had the pleasure of meeting him. But Ed loved pies from Rock Springs. He would go out of his way to pick up a pie in Rock Springs. A rhubarb strawberry pie. Oh, you love that. That's his favorite. And then he loved the mixed berry with crumb topping. And if you've never had a Rock Spring pie with crumb topping, you are missing it. And he loved that. And he also loved the Jack Daniel's pecan pie. Oh. Well, I'll tell you what, as I said, he'd go out of his way. He'd go up there and he'd pick up these pies, and he would be on some committees here at church, and he'd say, Jim, bring the committee over to my house. We'll have a meeting over at my house, and either at the midway point or at the end of the meeting, we'll have some pie. Oh, how can you turn that down? And so we'd go over, and we'd have pies. And as we were sharing in this delicious delicacy, what Ed would do would boast about those pies. He would tell us how he came to know about the Rock Springs pies, and then he would boast and boast and boast. He would boast so much that at that moment in time, it might have been at 9:30 at night, I felt the passion to go out, hop in my car, and drive up 17 to get my own pie. That's how much he boasted passionately about those pies. Just so you know, when we were headed up 17 this past week, we got a peach pie with crumb topping. Oh my God! And the reason why we stopped, may I say, the reason why I stopped was because of Ed O'Connor's boasting of those pies. And so this morning I asked you to think about somebody in your family to boast about. I thought maybe you'd have a hard time doing that. You didn't have a hard time doing that at all. You were able to boast about your family members. You know, think of all the things we boast about. Your favorite football team, your favorite actor, your greatest accomplishment, your alma mater. Oh boy, a lot of you boast about your alma mater. Your favorite candidate for the 2016 election. The fact that you can eat really hot, spicy food. You know, those people drive me crazy. How you can function so well with so little sleep each night. And the list could go on and on and on about the things that we boast about. Now, some boasting is really great. You know, when you were boasting about your family members, especially if you tell your family member, you know, how proud you are of them, and the success that they're making of their life, and the accomplishment that they have, that kind of boasting is a good thing because it encourages people. But there are some types of boastings that aren't so good, especially when we are always boasting about ourselves. In fact, the more we boast about ourselves, the more we begin to think that we know so much. There are many people today, when you get right down to it, who believe that they actually know better than God. And I think that's not only true today, that's been true throughout all of history, even back in Paul's day. Their worldly wisdom, they believe, is greater than God's divine wisdom. A young man went out for a walk just to meditate. He lived in the Midwest. He went out on a farm where they were growing pumpkins, acres and acres of pumpkins. And that farm had been there for a long time. In fact, there had been this oak tree that had been growing there, and it just grew and grew. It was a stately oak tree. And so he got to the tree and he sat down just to meditate a little bit. He sat right there at the foot of that big tree. And as he looked up, he started to observe tiny little acorns that were being held there by these massive branches from the tree. And then he glanced out at the acres and acres of pumpkins, and he noticed how these great big pumpkins were growing on these tiny little vines. And as he meditated for a while, he said to himself, you know, God made a mistake. God made a mistake. He should have put the tiny little acorns on these tiny little vines. He should have put the great big pumpkins up on those great big branches of that tree. Then, pondering God's apparent mistake, he just took a short cat nap and he fell asleep. He was awoken a short time later when an acorn fell and hit him on the nose. And when he woke up, he says, hey, maybe God was right after all. See how often we, from a worldly point of view, think we know what is right, we know what is certain, we know what is logical, and yet, repeatedly, we find ourselves to be wrong. We assume that we are doing the wise thing, but soon we discover that what we have done or proposed is foolishness. We even dare to challenge the way that the Almighty has created the universe. Paul concludes what appears to be foolishness may indeed be, in the final analysis, the evidence of God's wisdom. Paul was out preaching. He's preaching there in Corinth to the people there. And in Corinth, he encountered a very similar reaction that I have seen today, where people put their worldly wisdom ahead of God's wisdom. His message of the gospel of grace and love from God was met with ridicule and derision. And what was particularly objectionable was his reference to the cross. People could understand that there was a God. I mean, most of the people to whom Paul was speaking believed in many gods. And they could understand that God might love us and want to show some grace to us. But what they could not grasp is that an all-powerful God would enter into the world and reveal his greatest strength by dying on a cross. I mean, what kind of a victorious king, what kind of a awesome warrior ever revealed his power by dying? Nonetheless, Paul continued in the same vein, explaining, for the message of the cross, it may be foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. And although the reputed wise people of Paul's day thought what he said was pure foolishness, the weakness of the cross was in reality the power of God. This supposedly helpless man upon the cross, paradoxically, had the power to make people like you and me truly strong. And yet to so many people, it just didn't make sense. Paul's own kindred, the Jews, I mean, they interpreted the cross as foolishness. Although many of the Jews had long awaited the coming of a Messiah, their picture of who the Messiah was going to be did not match up with the picture that Paul was presenting to them that day. A common Jewish image of the Messiah was someone in the lines of King David, but even better, even stronger, a mighty warrior who would deliver the covenant people from their oppressors. Surely the wonder-working Messiah would not be a man who would be sentenced to die upon a cross, the symbol of a convicted criminal. Likewise, the Greeks thought the cross was foolishness. These wise men, skilled in debate and endless discussion about the nature of so many gods, were sure of one thing. That was that the gods would never defile themselves by becoming like one of us. It was simply inconceivable to them that Jesus could be considered divine and yet allow mere human beings to torture him and put him to death upon a cross. Whoever he was, in the Greeks' estimation, he was not the Son of God. And despite the opposition from both Jews and Greeks, a strange thing happened whenever Paul announced or preached the good news. Although the cross was a stumbling block to many pious Jews and sophisticated Greeks, there were always some people, some of them being Jews, some of them being Greeks, who responded to the foolishness of the cross. And those who believed learned what Paul was really trying to convey, namely that God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Paul draws this particular argument to a close by reminding the Corinthian Christians to look closely at their own fellowship. And we could do the same. We could do the same by looking at the membership of Desert Palms. By and large, the people who composed the church at Corinth, they did not consist of the intellectual elite, the power brokers, or the celebrities in the Corinthian society. The Christians were not of noble birth. They were ordinary people. Not only a few were slaves. And yet God chose these most unlikely persons, in his own words, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are. And why did God work out his plan in this manner? Was it not so that no one could take credit for their own salvation and say, look at me, and boast in themselves? The Christian faith is the only religion that teaches that we cannot save ourselves. We need a Savior, each and every one of us. We need God in our life to do that which is impossible for us to do. We better humble ourselves. In other words, if there's any boasting to be done, Paul says, it's in this: boast in the Lord. And church history has been a continuing commentary on Paul's contention that he uses, that the nobodies of this world are the ones who bear witness to the Lord's kingdom, power, and glory. Ever heard of John Bunyan? Not Paul Bunyan. John Bunyan. Born in 1619 to a poor family. A nobody. Born in Bedford, England. His formal education was quite meager. He only had 2 years of education. After serving in Oliver Cromwell's army, he went back to Bedford to take up his dad's occupation, which was just mending pots and pans. 1648, he had met this Christian woman, beautiful in his eyes, and he married her. He never heard the gospel before. She told him the gospel, read through the Bible, and eventually he went on to become a Baptist preacher because of his wife's testimony to him. Despite his ready acceptance among so many of the common people in Bedford, his life was never easy. In fact, when he became a preacher, he had a certain preaching style. It was a Puritan preaching style. And it offended some of the more staid Church of England officials of his day. He was not politically correct, I guess, for his day. And as a result, they set him up and they convicted him to go to prison for 12 years. Basically saying he didn't have a license to preach. He was there in prison for 12 years because of his preaching, because he put his faith in God. And you might start getting mad at God. You might get upset at God because I was doing what you asked me to do, God, and I'm stuck in this prison. But no, he never lost his faith. He was always upbeat. He actually wrote a book while he was in prison. You may have read it, The Pilgrim's Progress, which was to become a classic allegory. And in this extraordinary story, he depicts a man leaving his family with a book in one hand and a burden. It's an allegory, a burden of sin on his back. He meets evangelists who advises him to get out of the city of destruction, get out through the wicket gate. And he makes his travels, and along the way, he meets numerous colorful characters like Hopeful and Faithful and foes as well, such as worldly wisdom and hypocrisy and giant despair. And he makes his way along the road, confronted by one obstacle after another. And all the time he is weighed down by this heavy burden he's carrying on his back. And at last he comes to the cross. And in one of the most unforgettable scenes depicting human liberation from the burden of sin, Bunyan explains what happens, and I quote, "Just as Christian came upon the cross, his burden loosed from off his shoulders, fell from off his back, began to tumble, and so continued to do so till it came to the mouth of the tomb, where it fell in, and I saw it no more." Bunyan's own dynamic source of strength, even in the midst of his persecution, was rooted in Jesus Christ and the cross on which Christ died, and enabled him to endure prolonged persecution in prison. John Bunyan, a nobody, demonstrated dramatically how God can use someone who others consider a totally insignificant human being. God confounded the wise with this simple man, John Bunyan. John Bunyan boasted in the Lord. And indeed, that's what we're called to do. That's Paul's point here in Corinthians. It's that the cross of Christ is for all people. And so often it seems to be the nobodies in the world who respond with the most faith and most willingness. We should never be ashamed to identify ourselves with the cross. We should never be ashamed to identify ourselves with the one who died upon that cross, Jesus Christ. And if anyone ever receives glory in this world, something to boast about, then the boast should actually be in the Lord who has made it possible. Went to a marriage conference with Kathy years ago. And the way this conference worked is they had facilitators, Christian couples who would lead each one of the seminars. There's one couple, I remember they came up, and in the first seminar they led, they talked about their Christian faith, about how they had both grown up as Christians. They had met in high school. Because they were Christians, that what drew them together. They got married, found a church, the church they loved, the church of which they were proud, the church of which they could boast. They were strong, committed Christians. And you learned that at the first session, and that's good, because if you're going to learn something about marriage, you want to learn it from committed Christians. But in another seminar later on, they said, you know, as our life progressed, all of our friends were just in church. Every one of our friends was in church. We had no friends outside church, so one day they had come across a couple in their apartment building that were not Christians. They didn't go to church. They said, great, we're going to befriend them, and they did. And a friendship took off. In fact, every Saturday night, without fail, it became a routine. The two couples, the Christians and these non-Christians, got together. They shared meals. They shared dessert. They shared pie. they shared going out to movies and plays and doing things. Game nights. Every Saturday night, like clockwork, for more than 3 years. And then one night, the non-Christian couple said to the other couple, we are so sorry, but we have to break our commitment this Saturday night. We just can't meet with you. Something else has come up. And the Christian couple, they're just going like, what did we do something? Did we scare them off? What has happened? But 2 weeks later, the non-Christian couple called up the Christian couple and said, come on over to our apartment this week. We'll serve dinner and dessert. We got some good news for you. So they came over and they shared dinner, and with no discussion of why they had missed the last Saturday get together. And then before dessert was served, they said, they cleared the table and said, we've got some great news to share with you. The non-Christian couple said to the Christian couple, last week, on Saturday night, we were invited to a Saturday night service at a church. First time we'd ever been to church. First time anybody had ever invited us to church. And we heard about God. We heard about Jesus Christ. They read from the scriptures. Those beautiful words. The music was powerful. Afterwards, they had a fellowship time. We met so many people. It was fabulous. And you know what we want to do? We want to invite you don't understand. We are Christians. We've gone to church every Sunday our entire life. And then you know who got a rock in their stomach? The non-Christian couple. Their expression completely changed from joy to astonishment. It's like, what? We've been spending 3.5 years with you every Saturday night, and you have never once mentioned God, Jesus Christ, the Bible, or ever invited us to your church. The facilitator said, basically the friendship ended that night. They were so upset. But they said, we learned something from that. That we must take the opportunity to share God and Jesus Christ with other people. We need to become cheerleaders for Christ. I told you about Ed O'Connor and how he boasted in pies. The thing about Ed O'Connor, he also boasted in something else. He boasted in God. He boasted in Jesus Christ. He was proud of this church. We'd have pancake breakfast. And what did Ed O'Connor do? He would stand up with a microphone about every 20 minutes and say, welcome to Desert Palm Presbyterian Church. Maybe some of you have never been here before. I'd love to take any of you who want to on a tour of this church. And when he gave a tour of this church, he expressed how proud he was of this church and how proud he was of Jesus Christ and what God had done in his life. He was a cheerleader for God. Let's try it. Give me a C.
C.
Give me an H.
H.
Give me an R. Give me an I. Give me an S.
S.
Give me a T.
T.
What's the spell?
Christ.
Okay, give me another C.
C.
Give me an H.
H.
Give me a U.
U.
Give me an R.
R.
Give me a C.
C.
Give me an H.
H.
What's the spell?
Church.
Good. I'm glad you can spell both words. Jesus Christ and the church. If you're going to boast in anything, my friends, boast in Christ and boast in your church. I shared this Acts 16:5 thing with you about our vision, meeting the needs of the people in the community. Do you realize, just like the couple I mentioned a moment ago, there are people in this community never been to church. No one invites them to church. You need to invite them to church. Well, what if they say no? I don't care. Invite them to church. It's not a matter of whether or not they come. It's a matter of whether or not you ask them. Tell them about God. Tell them about Jesus Christ. Well, what am I going to invite them to? Invite them to worship. Next Sunday, Christine Anderson is going to be here. Unbelievable musician. And I'll give you a sermon next week of which you'll be proud. Invite people to church. My friends, we are called to be cheerleaders for Jesus Christ. Cheerleaders for the church we love. I encourage you to invite people to church. For if you're going to boast, boast in the Lord. Amen.